the last question talks about training load. So how can you better calculate training load? So from a skier perspective, training load can largely be calculated by duration and intensity. So looking at how much are you training and how intense is it? So a good example would be two people can train 300 hours in a year, but that could look the load of that can be entirely different depending on the intensity. So those things, so training load times intensity are what kind of or training duration times intensity are kind of what help you calculate your load. So if someone does 300 hours a year and 250 of that is all level 1 or zone 1 versus another person doing 300 hours a year and 150 hours of it is at zone 1 and 150 hours of it is at zone 3, that person's going to carry a lot higher training load just because they're spending, the intensity is higher of their training. So you can kind of, not that you necessarily have to have a exact calculation of what your training load is. Training Peaks does kind of provide that when they look at fatigue and freshness and what each session is doing. And you can kind of see your fatigue curve during higher training periods go up and your freshness curve go down. And then when you're kind of peaking, those will overlap and your fresh curve will surpass the fatigue curve. So Training Peaks does actually do a really nice job of kind of giving you an idea of what that is, and that they use heart rate and intensity and duration to calculate those things. So it's very similar. So you can really get a good idea of that, and it should align with kind of the training that you're doing. So if you're in this upcoming training period, if you're in the third week and it's a volume week, and your fatigue is probably going to be pretty high compared to what it would look like at the end of a recovery week. So your fatigue is going to be high and your freshness will be a bit lower. And then those things will come a bit more even when you start to recover. And that's kind of a good way to look at your training load and what it is, and knowing that it does fluctuate throughout the training period and throughout the training year. When you get closer to the winter, your fatigue will never get quite as high and your freshness will never get quite as low because you're racing. So you want to be a little bit fresher. And then if you do have those few races throughout the year that you're kind of pinpointing as target races and ones you maybe want to try and peak for, ideally your freshness does surpass your fatigue and you do see and you are quite a bit fresher. So but I would say look at the makeup of your training is the best way to look at your training load. So if you're training X amount of hours a week, which is X amount of hours in a training block, which leads to X amount of hours in a year, what does the makeup of those hours look like? As skiers, at least 80% of our training should be done at a low intensity. And then the other 20% is filled by threshold, level 4, racing, and strength training. So knowing that about 80% of your training should be done at a low intensity is a really good place to start. And that should help you moderate your training load as you're going through these training periods with ups and downs of how much you're training and how hard you're training and how much recovery you're getting or not getting. So training load, duration, times intensity, the higher it's a multiplication. So the higher either one of those goals, the higher your training load goes. Keeping those things in moderation and understanding that can really help to calculate that. And looking a little bit at your heart rate too, if you do track that, if you notice signs like, okay, my heart rate has been, if you look at your resting heart rate, if your resting heart rate has been elevated for a week, your training load is probably really high. So you maybe want to adjust and decrease your training load because physiologically you're not getting a positive response from your training. Same thing if you're out training and your heart rate looks to be on average higher than it normally is for a several day period, you're likely experiencing a pretty high training load and maybe need to decrease those kinds of those things. Ideally, for the same effort over a period of time, you see your heart rate go down because you're getting fitter. So seeing that consistently happen should be the goal with one of the goals with training, and a good way to monitor your load as well. So yeah, kind of a long response to that one, but it is very in depth in how you can look at it. Training Peaks does a really nice job, so I would recommend looking at the fitness or the fatigue and freshness curve